It came from. It came from.
Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and get into this next one. This next one is from our Discord by He Who Shall Not Be Named, Lord Voldemort himself. Let's see here. So he writes, for anyone who might have any insight, how far behind will a distance program put me from an in-person program? I'm still active duty military, so I can't attend a full-time program now, but I get a stipend to help with the cost if I take classes while still active duty. If I pursue a master's from a distance program versus a traditional in-person program, will it affect my hireability or mess with the actual education I receive, assuming I go to a reputable, accredited program from a brick and mortar school that offers the program? Blake, let's talk about the differences between in-person programs and online courses or online programs. Go.
Yeah, the only way I can really talk about this is giving you a kind of my perspective on what I think is going to be the difference. And I know there are plenty of reputable programs that I've actually now recently heard of that are doing the kind of like distance masters. I know Embry-Riddle is one of them. Super reputable school. In this particular case, might be of a lot of interest to you because I know that this particular Discord member likes aviation. And I want to address the one part in here that I think is probably most important is will it change my hireability if I'm doing it in person versus not? I don't think the degree that you get, I don't think it's going to say in person versus not. It's just going to say you have a master's and you've achieved this level of education. I think what is going to be different and will require probably a lot of proactivity is my guess is the networking side of it that really helps you kind of make a lot of those connections to get that first job or, get into a lab or be a part of different, human factors style organizations like HFES as a student. That will be completely different. Now you're in an interesting situation though, because you're already employed, you're active duty. So maybe that's not as big of a deal. The other thing that I would be a little bit concerned about, and this is only my take on it, is it was invaluable to me to work in the lab that I worked in, because it led to my first internship. It gave me my first set of leadership experience. It let me apply the methodology. I was learning it as I was learning, it made countless connections and friends that I wouldn't have without the experience. And on top of that, it also led me to my mentor who I ended up doing my thesis under. So without that in-person experience, it was all centered around the work I was doing in addition to the learning. I'm not sure how that's going to pan out or how it works. Now, I know there's a lot of reputable schools out there with master's programs online. There has to be some way they're supplementing this because they still would, I would assume, still would have to make you do some kind of thesis work and work with a professor and maybe potentially contribute to a lab somehow or in some fashion, whether it's like writing or whatever it may be, doing data analysis from afar. So ultimately, I think you're going to get the same education, but the experience is going to be different in your applied experience of that knowledge is not necessarily going to be the same, or at least that would be my biggest markers of difference from, in person versus traditional brick and mortar. But Nick, give us some of your thoughts here.
Yeah, I'm largely in the same boat as you, Blake. I think the main difference between the two is going to be the networking aspect. So I actually reached out to him separately and talked to him a little bit about this earlier. So forgive me if any of this is duplicate from what we talked about. But just going through the questions. How far behind will a distance program put me from an in-person program? It kind of depends, like Blake said, on how proactive you would be. But in terms of the actual paper that you get that says you have a degree, not at all. In terms of you being active duty military, now this is a great advantage to you. I think this gives you a lot of experience in a certain sector. So if you were to go into DoD work, you already have that massive knowledge that you can bring in, from the perspective of a previous user of a system. Let's say you worked on flight controls or something like that. You could be used almost like an SME, a subject matter expert that could then inform the design. You want to be careful with that. because systems change over time and you don't want to bring in sort of antiquated ways of thinking about something years down the line, right? In terms of stipend, that is pretty big for some people. And so I would strongly consider maybe using that if you can. There are also options to transfer credits. So let's say you are taking this online version and your service ends, and then you might want to switch over to a PhD program like we just talked about with Michelle's question, right? Kind of depends on your path. That stipend is going to be really great, at least to get in and get your feet wet. You might want to try a couple classes while still active duty. In terms of distance versus traditional in-person program, let's break this down, right? You mentioned hireability or mess with actual education that you receive. So let's talk about hireability. I think that you will be, it depends on what you do with it, right? Now, if you just do the program, don't get into any internships, don't get any of that real world experience, don't work in a lab even remotely, then it might not do as much for you. There might be you might get less opportunities than you might like Blake said, he got his first internship from working in a lab. I had a very similar experience where my internship would not have happened if I wasn't at an in-person program. And so I think having those connections, working in a lab with the professor of your choice, working on projects that interest you, and then lastly, sort of having your professor be able to make those connections for you. I think that is huge, especially just getting into the field. Having that introduction of like, hey, I know so-and-so and they might be a good fit for you. Why don't you give them an interview? That's huge. Getting the door open. In terms of the actual education you receive, now there's been a ton of studies on, whether or not remote learning is as effective as in-person learning. And I think with COVID, the way things hit, it's just really different now, the way we all view it. And so there's still some research to be done on that perspective. I will say there's an undeniable effect that you have from being in person. You lock eyes with somebody else in a physical space when they call on you, forces your fight or flight response to go, oh, yes, I need to dig up this answer right now, or else I'm going to be embarrassed. And then if you are embarrassed, then you go and research that so you don't be embarrassed next time. There's a whole social aspect of being in person that happens. In terms of the information that's being presented to you, I know in several cases it's the same a lot of the time. They record the in-person sessions, put it up online, and you watch it later or at your leisure or whatever. But you don't get that interaction. You can't ask questions in the moment and have them elaborate on it. You can ask them questions post hoc, but the context might not be there. You can say things like, hey, in class tonight, you mentioned this, that, the other thing. They're not in that mode anymore. They're in office hours mode. They're doing other stuff, but a question might come in, and so they might answer it, but they might not answer it in the same way that they would have done in that context. Those are the major differences that I can see. And so just in terms of content, you'll be fine, but the interaction bit adds a little bit more to it. If you think you can get beyond that, then that's fine, right? I think you'll be all right with distance learning. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Anything else to add to this one, Blake?
No, I think that was a really great breakdown, Nick, and hopefully this helps with some of the decision making. Either way, you're likely to end up with a very good education, regardless of kind of whether you're doing it in person or from afar.